My name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy&Future.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Świdziński. I'm the Director of Analysis at Strategy&Future. And today with us is Jacek Bartosiak, who is here to talk about strategic flows.
Hi Albert.
Hi, how are you, Jacek? How are you doing?
Yeah, fine, thanks.
Thank you. The first thing I would like to ask, though, is how come the very first text on our webpage does not concern nuclear policy or the F-35 purchase Poland is currently pursuing, but rather strategic flows? What are they and why are they so important?
It's simple. History of the world is driven by geopolitics, and geopolitics is driven by strategic flows. Strategic flows is all about movement of people, movement of goods, flow of technology, flow of data, flow of capital, and actually the movement, how people move about their issues and how the nations and powers carry through their interests that are always located in some geographical space. The last 30 years was the era of globalization. And globalization was based on the freedom of strategic flows. Freedom of movement of people, of goods, free flow of services, free flow of data, technology, exchanges of people, correlations of different interactions between people, technology. It was all about access to the global market. This was a very peculiar period in the history of the world. And this was all thanks to the US Navy and the US power projection that was stabilizing the world system. So we may say that globalization was made possible by the freedom of strategic flows, and this freedom and globalization as a consequence was made possible by the power of the United States in the world system. This is now changing. There are challengers trying to contest the system. And moreover, United States recently realized that if the system is going to last as it was, developing over the last 30 years, the United States will lose its preponderance in the system, mostly to China.
So in other words, the last 30 years were an oddity and not a standard, not a given. And we very much grew used to the idea that this is how it is always going to be, that this is how the world is going to look forever.
Sure, we quickly grew used to this fact because it was fun and it was good. We had access to everything. All you needed to have was the good service, the good product, and you were having the access to the global market. That was perfect, especially for small nations from middle powers that couldn't make its way on their own if there was no system. So that was perfect, and it seemed that it would last forever. That we crossed this line of perennial competition, especially in Eurasia, which is an epicenter of the world, a super axis of world affairs, supercontinent, that everything important is going on. And all world wars
Happened in Eurasia.
Occurred in Eurasia. And what I wanted to say is globalization that was underpinned by the freedom of flows, strategic flows, made two things possible, or two developments possible. Basically, there was more prosperity. So we all grew in prosperity, albeit unequal. The growth was unequal. We'll get back to it later. And more connectedness or connectivity, more interactions. So everything became more congested, closer, more frequent. Interactions were more frequent. And that created interdependence in the global system of supply chains, of production and services, of different parts of, the maps, different regions, the different nations. There were winners and losers of the process. The winners were especially placed nations and powers that were conveniently located: Singapore, Poland, China, that had not only location but also good institutions and elites that allowed this to happen by properly organizing the social contract and the system to be able to take part in this drive towards globalization. There were losers. For sure, the losers were some of the layers of the Western society, the so-called middle class of the United States, France, some other countries. They were losers of the system. The industrialization was a fact. It moved to China, to Bangladesh, to Poland, to other countries that benefited from the US underpinned global system.
So I don't know if it's time to say that or if it's even true. But I think in this system that was largely set up by the United States, courtesy of the institutions it established, of just the sheer power it had, it seems that the United States now considers itself a loser in this whole equation, right? In many ways.
Sort of. As I said, the industrialization and the structural decline of the middle class that in the long run would cut the foundation of the United States. It's true. And I think that the United States establishment realized that. And recently launched a sort of a policy or launched a campaign of reverting it, of sort of changing this trajectory. That's why we see the US-China showdown. We'll get back to this issue later. What I wanted to add is that globalization created this interdependence. And it's fine. Actually, it's even fun because you could order from that place, you could supply to the other place. Everybody was happy and making money. The problem is that it exists, and it can only exist if there is one set of rules of the road that govern how you interact. And it may only happen if there is one hegemon, and one leader of the system, and that was the United States and its power projection capability of its military, and especially the Navy, that projects power far away from the continental United States into the Eurasian littorals. And as I said, it's the Eurasia that is the epicenter of the world and strategic flows. And that has been contested recently by anti-Axter denial capabilities, by the policy of China and Iran and, of course, Russia. And now the system is in chaos. And then look, Albert, what happens if it's contested. Then this freedom of strategic flows becomes a battlefield of who is imposing rules. And we can see it already unfolding. Then interdependence, that was fine in the time of peace and stability, becomes a field of leverages and vulnerabilities. Weaker parties, weaker nations, weaker businesses become vulnerable because suddenly it's all about power. That means capability to impose your will. And then the bigger powers execute their power. And this is the old game of Eurasia. And we're back to this game. It's sad to say so, but that's the case.
The geopolitical pause is gone, shortly speaking.
Yes, the pause, as we say here in Poland and Central and Eastern Europe, this pause is gone. We can see it already in the rear mirror, but the contour of the new world, new system, is not yet visible. The United States has entered the road for restoration of its hegemony, of its leadership, which was very benign for some, for sure for Poland and Central and Eastern Europe, and very convenient and also favorable. It created favorable conditions for development. But at the same time, apparently it was not good for some of challengers.
I mean, Ari Crow would say that it had to be benevolent.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you read exactly through the Crow's memorandum, the memorandum that was drafted more than 100 years ago by the British diplomat, that a sea power, dominant sea power, cannot run the policy that is sort of selfish, but
Runs counter to the
yes,
interests of the world.
yes, because then it is regarded as very aggressive by banning the access to the world ocean, which is the main thoroughfare, a main highway of strategic flows. So it has to go in line with other nations that want to take part in this openness.
And only then it can be accepted, right?
Yes,
as a dominant power.
exactly. And it's all about strategic flows. As the United States, being a dominant navy, being a dominant sea power, is trying to show the strength and power in the world ocean. And this is what you can see in the Strait of Hormuz. And this is what you can see in other places, in the Western Pacific contingency.
First island chain.
First Island, yes, exactly. South China Sea, East China Sea, and all those air sea battle concepts and offshore defense, archipelago defense, third offset strategy, all those concepts that are supposed to mitigate or even offset or defeat the Chinese rising maritime power in the Western Pacific, or other concepts that are supposed to enable the power projection capabilities into Europe, like multi-domain battle, that is, an instrument, a sort of a concept to provide help to Poland and other Eastern NATO flank countries that might seem to be a little bit on their own because it's far away from the Atlantic. So this is about the strength and the perception of strength in Eurasia and the U.S. power projection capabilities. What I wanted to say is that if we talk about flow control, strategic flows and the control of the strategic flows, it's all about three basic features. The first one is defining the rules and enforcing them. Sanctions that are right now plentiful. You can see them being imposed everywhere. Deciding upon access to geospatial corridors of flows and maneuverability within those corridors. Strait of Hormuz, Malacca, South China Sea, and the response of the Chinese, the bastion strategy of creating artificial islands that are sort of imposing friction of the strategic flow, so that in order to show that it's us, the Chinese, that have the leverage. We control this waterway. Also, such a place where you need to have maneuverability and access to it and project political power into it is the Northern European plain and Poland and Ukraine, Central and Eastern Europe, that effectively monopolize the strategic flows along the main axis of transportation, east, west, north, and south. That's why there were so many wars over Poland. There were so many wars over our space, and ours and Ukraine. That's why these are pivotal places, as duly characterized by Mackinder and Świdziński, and also other strategies in the past. And this will be also of importance in the future. And here at Strategy and Future, we want to discuss it. Your Northern European plain, Poland, Central Eastern Europe, Persian Gulf, and Western Pacific, the three main corridors of strategic flows.
And when you speak of the rules of the road that govern the transfer of goods, the way it's organized, I think it's important to mention how very different is the understanding of who has the preponderance, who has the power over the regions such as South China Sea, and how it's defined, right? The US defines it on the background of international maritime law, of international law, and China just says it's 9-line. This is our sphere of influence. We decide what happens there. And this is a stark difference, right?
Stark difference, and I regret to say that it may, boil down to the military showdown. Because, in the escalation ladder, at the end of the day, it's the military power that is imposing. This is why we have this air sea battle concept, the Chinese bastion strategy, which we discussed, the multi-domain, and this sort of military muscle, showing the muscle, showing the strength. This is all about the military and power projection of the United States, where the United States is saying everywhere that it's strong enough, it has a big navy, and so on and so forth.
Or lack thereof.
Or lack thereof, but it depends how you perceive it, of course. Yeah, and everybody here, for example, in Poland, is every day analyzing how strong or how weak the United States is, and whether it can really project power here effectively to help us in any sort of showdown or pressure from Russia. And probably nations in the Western
Baltics.
Pacific, do the same every day, because it's in the flux. It's always in the motion. It's never static. The perception and power is never a static feature. So it's very important. What I wanted to add also to our thesis, Albert, here about the strategic flows is also, and I think that sometimes in the US it's not being properly noticed across Eurasia, that strategic flows are being made, of course, not only on the world ocean, but through enablers. You need to have enablers. And enablers are, of course, infrastructure, seaports, highways, trains, high-speed, infrastructure that through which the flows traverse. This is like vessels in your body, transporting blood, and also technology that changes connectivity. Combustion engine, steam power,
Today's
aviation,
iteration of it as in
5G
Yeah,
thing,
exactly.
of which we will be discussing at length.
Sure will.
Yes, at Strategy and Future. Transportation means, look how trains change the correlation of power on the European peninsula. Russian railway system, and especially German railway system, changed transportation of goods and troops, military, because projecting power is also the movement of people and strategic flows, access to your allies, correlation of power, and how it changed in the 19th and 20th century, the correlation within
And what
the
it
Eurasia.
caused as well, because let us remember that very ambitious concepts of Imperial Germany, such as the Baghdad-Berlin Railway, right?
Yeah, exactly. Good
And
point.
how UK reacted to it.
Exactly. And sea powers were very anxious about such developments, and the strategic flows could sort of have new supply chains and the new corridors to traverse, and the UK's perception of influence was weakening. And, you can, cut long story short, all projects that connect more within Eurasia and empower the continental powers are always a threat to the sea powers like United States or Great Britain. And this is how you should perceive Belt and Road Initiative or New Silk Road, whatever you call it. This is a grandiose, a huge. It's very difficult even to find the proper adjective to describe it, because
You'll have to look to Donald Trump's Twitter.
maybe because
tremendous.
Yes, this is the what Xi Jinping announced in Astana about a few years ago is a potentially world-changing system of new supply chains,
And let us
far away from the world ocean, far away from the U.S. Navy control of strategic flows, or at least parallel to it, that can transform Eurasia. Poland, by the way, is on its way. I mean, on the way. Poland and many other countries. And I think that United States establishment was asleep long and woke up to this new reality taking place in Eurasia recently. And what we see now is the attempt by Washington to sort of reverse the trajectory.
Which is very justified, because if you think of what could possibly make, for example, Cannon or Spikeman wake up at night, sweating bullets, is the idea.
Sure. It's a mixture of peril and probably nightmare of Cannon combined with Mackinder and Spikeman and many other sea power strategies that were afraid of connectivity within Eurasia.
Yes.
That could
Coherent network.
That could springboard the regional hegemon and create a dominant power in Eurasia, and that's paradigm number one in the United States. Never allow this to happen.
And let us remember, because drawing back to Crow Memorandum, right? This was written in 1907, I believe. And this was against the backdrop of United Kingdom rivalry with the German Empire.
Yeah, it's good. It's good to mention that Crow Memorandum, as this still, has some bearing today.
A lot.
Again, to cut long story short, it was proposing that Great Britain should never use the control of the world ocean, the main highway of strategic flows, as a open, sword of control. So banning others from using it. Rather, it should create a policy where all small and middle tier nations could participate in the strategic flows, so that the Great Britain presents itself as a sort of a main beneficiary of the world, and through it and in complement of that, realize its policy. Once it is abandoned, there were balancing coalitions against Great Britain. So that was a sort of a warning, admonition to the Great Britain that never never conduct the policy that would be against the interests of small nations.
So taking that into account, what do you think of the very recent Donald Trump tweet on 24th of June, I believe? He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically said, oh, by the way, Japan and China are getting most of its oil through the Strait of Hormuz. And why exactly are we, as the United States, protecting it?
Yeah.
And we're not getting paid? What happens?
I think
so. What is that?
That message touches exactly this issue. It's sort of, signals that the United States is treating the main highway of strategic flows as something not given
For granted.
And now you need to pay for that, or it will not be open for use. And this is approaching this memorandum, this cross memorandum's red line. And
Red line, yeah.
whether it's crossed already, I don't know, but it usually accelerates hardball competition in Eurasia. And I'm sure that all bells are ringing in Beijing, and the need for creating the alternative supply chain is in acceleration.
But also they probably might be ringing in any other capitals of countries that are export heavy, right? And Germany.
Oh, of course, it should.
Like
it should, because Germany is vulnerable. It's fully dependent upon the openness of the world ocean. And like many others, everybody actually, it's a scary situation, because it means that we may not only scale down, but break down globalization. And then again, we will be having, and what Chinese are labeling the competing connectivity. This is why the Chinese are developing, all this concept of building infrastructure, seaports, buying it, building it, developing it, railways through Eurasia, buying stuff like that, places like that, like Piraeus and railways in Europe, having access to yes, exactly, to infrastructure, Guadar, many other places that are creating or enabling strategic flows. Now we understand. I hope that our people that will be listening to us now will understand what the Chinese have been playing over the last year, as if in anticipating that the hegemon of the world ocean might be inclined to issue this warning that this was only, it seemed only to be free. But basically, once it's not in the interest of the United States, it will not be free. And this is this, game of perceptions, and a very dangerous path that we are on. And I hope that at Strategy and Future, by the way, Albert, we will be extensively talking and writing about those issues that will be unfolding right now in Eurasia, that was pushed by this showdown between China and US into a very chaotic situation of major flux.
Because I don't know if you're going to agree with me on this one, Jacek, but basically the point, if you extrapolate what Trump said, is not just who will protect the sea lanes, but how exactly are they going to protect them from us?
Yeah,
which is going quite far. It's a risky statement here.
He didn't say that, but if your brain is working hard, you can really deduct it.
It's a long shot, but you can see that happening, and I don't think anybody who thinks seriously about the welfare of their state could ignore that question, right?
Of course, Albert, it's easy. controlling strategic flows, it's about allowing my own use and my friends' use, and denying my enemy's use of it.
Which is what everybody forgets, but it's the bottom
and
line.
because everybody has to buy and sell and produce and grow, then it means that, you know, you're sort of denying you, you're in decline. I mean, or you don't grow. And it's a, you know, zero-sum game. It's kicking in. And this is what is happening and might happen even more. And I will tell you even more. That creates leverages and vulnerabilities. Big powers, major powers will have more leverages. And if we go down the escalator or up the escalation ladder, it will be quite clear very soon that there are places more important than less important. The places where strategic flows occur are more important. And there, major powers will be projecting political power into it by having, you know, diplomatic measures and military power projection, like Strait of Hormuz, like Malacca, like South China Sea, like Poland and Ukraine. And that may, you know, end up also with some geoeconomic measures, because you also need to sort of create additional conditions to help someone of your allies or deny this help to someone else. And it will not be a market game. So we may witness less of Adam Smith's
Invisible
hand of free market economy, and more of geoeconomic tools of, especially, you know, the champions of the authoritarian countries, helping with infrastructure, subsidies. On the other hand, maybe new Marshall plans or Belt and Road subsidy. You know, more of state and deep pockets with, you know, fists, and less of Adam Smith, as I said. And this is one thing. Another development will be new fields of competition, contests over zones of influence, allies and friends, decoupling of economy, which is you know, the story of this year in Washington D.C. That the United States is of thinking that they need to decouple from the Chinese economy, otherwise they will not be able to undermine the Chinese growth. They need to decouple, because otherwise, and what decoupling means? It means the stoppage of the freedom of flows of technology. It means stoppage of freedom of trade exchange. So strategic flows will be sanctioned, the friction will be imposed. That changes the dynamics. And then it may turn out that it's not the public good. I mean, highway of world ocean will not be a public good, but it will be a good for your friends, your allies.
Regulamented.
Yes, for like-minded partners. Both ways. Maybe in South China Sea, if the Chinese will show that they have supremacy there, it will be only for the Chinese partner. Who knows? And this is why they are building up the bastion in the South China Sea, because at the end of the day, they might say that they control it, and only their friends say
making strides
yes.
in anti-ship.
This is why you compete over key geopolitical zones. And Poland has been such a zone for so long. Since, you know, at least since the moment when Germany became a major power and Russia became a major power, and they had to project power into Europe or to the east, and fear, or to send or trade, or, you know, bring raw materials. They needed control the main parallel lines of communications over Poland, you know, and Ukraine.
And this is the narrowest point of the North European plains. If you want to go from Asia to European peninsula, you must go through Poland, pretty much.
Exactly. If you take a look at the map between the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea, Ukraine, Poland, Romania, you know, this, and, you know, multiple nations situated between the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea, they monopolize the strategic flows between Greater Eurasia and Europe. So it's a critical, pivotal place, and this is a place where we live. Okay, and this is a place, and from this perspective, here at Strategy and Future, we'll be describing the world
from our perspective.
Yes.
And all the wars that happen here, the Mongols, the Swedes, Napoleonic campaigns, First World War, Second World War, they all happen here, right? And it's not a coincidence.
Yeah, in a balance, in a game of balance of power, you need to control strategic flows and the spaces where they traverse, and you need to seize control over particular points which are more or less important. So that's why it's so important, and especially it will grow in importance if the Belt and Road Initiative designed by China is in further development, because you cannot reach European peninsula by passing Poland or Romania. Okay, you can do it over
Bosphorus, right?
yes, but you need to do it in a maritime way, and still the U.S. Navy is still controlling it in a way. But if you want to do it over the land, over the Eurasian landmass, you need to have access through here, and that also will have some impact. It's already having impact on us and our neighborhood. So if the competition across Eurasia is intensifying as it is now, we'll be having a contest for norms and standards or new technology. Who is imposing those rules? And 5G is a perfect example of that. We'll get back to the 5G, in a few minutes.
Yeah.
By the way, at Strategy&Future shortly we will be discussing that in more detail and at length. So our listeners should stay tuned. Get ready for that. It's gonna be fun. Yeah, there will be a contest for narratives and about which social contract is better for delivering prosperity and delivering success, delivering projects. It's all probably in the near future, and if the competition is intensifying, this will become an open debate. So, I think that all that we have discussed will have a fundamental impact on business and on those interactions, dependencies that were created during the era of globalization that is now in sort of a recession and in decline or in a pullback.
Terminal stage.
It will affect the backbone of modern business, which are corporate supply chains.
Mm-hmm.
Talking about decoupling, what that means? It means a major, severe cuts through the supply chains, a major dislodgements of vested interests, with huge impacts on social contracts, on stability across Eurasia and the Western Pacific. We are expecting it here out of Strategy&Future. I will be describing it. And I think that the supply chains, which are the backbone of the global modern economy, will become the Clausewitzian center of gravity in this contest.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the United States also should take a deeper look at the inner Eurasia to see the Belt and Road unfolding and how to prepare a strategy how to deal with that, how to influence them. So, as we already know, and we discussion shows well, control of strategic flows bestows power. So it's all about power, pure power. And now, the unipolar moment is gone. Whether we will be having a multipolar world that usually ends up in the concert of powers in Eurasia, and we are landlocked here in Eurasia, Albert, in our country, or we will be having a restored US supremacy. It's not known yet, but on the way for this outcome, we will be sailing through the uncharted waters of sort of chaos and volatile times, with many events that may destabilize Eurasia even more. What is sometimes destabilizing, and it's already seen, if you have connectivity that changes the way strategic flows occur, sometimes you have new technology, steam engine, combustion, we discussed it. And 5G is also potentially such a factor that will change correlation of power that stems from how strategic flows are shaped and directed. 5G may also influence that heavily. This is why you need to see this contest, this sort of a turmoil or this discussion, a debate about 5G through those lenses.
And this is no accident that, for example, Steve Bannon said that destroying Huawei as a company, as a provider, number one, really, provider of 5G technology is, and I quote here Steve Bannon, it's not my opinion, but I quote him here, is 10 times as important as winning the trade war. And
Yeah.
winning,
All of this is important. Trade is important. Belt and Road is important. 5G is important, in my personal opinion, Albert. I know you will be writing the article about it soon at Strategy&Future. All is important. More connectivity in inner Eurasia, it means usually less power of the sea power of the United States. More strategic flows within Eurasia, it usually means less relative strategic flows control in the world ocean when the U.S. Navy is a dominant power. It's, of course, it's a little bit simplistic, but that's how it was. Take a look at the history of the last 500 years. It was the European sailors that sort of controlled the Atlantic Ocean, and they sailed to Americas. They sailed to India around Africa and then through Suez. And then they control those strategic flows, how the capital, technology cycles, everything, military power, and they colonize the world. Chinese want to reverse it. They want to reverse the last 500 years of how strategic flows are shaped along the main thoroughfare of the world ocean. And this is the task, quite daunting, and fundamental is too little to say.
Unparalleled, really,
yes,
right? In the history of the world.
Unparalleled. And what I'm really concerned here, being here in Poland, as Warsaw, the capital of Poland, is halfway geographically between Beijing and Washington D.C. And you can walk over the Eurasian landmass. You can walk to Beijing.
You can't walk to the D.C.
Cannot walk to D.C. And what is the future of the United States? Whether they can still sustain projecting power here? And what about their procurement programs? What about their feasibility of their economy? Of course, about China as well. But the United States is a distant power. And here in Eurasia, everything is more dense, congested, more acute.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have this sea buffer so that you can react from distance, having strategic patience, but potentially for strategic patience, strategic depth and time. It's more difficult here, so I'm really concerned about this new times.
And technology as 5G squeezes it even further, right?
Creating more geopolitics because creating more leverages.
Mm-hmm. And let us remember that telecoms and 5G is the pinnacle of the telecom technology at the moment. This really has become the avant-garde, the vanguard of the Chinese expansion into markets worldwide, right? In Africa, there was the head of Africom saying that the Chinese build their power over telecoms, over building internet infrastructure, broadband.
Yeah, of course there are many aspects. The aspect that you have mentioned there are undersea seabed cables that are being right now laid by the Chinese companies, and 95% of data, world data, are being transmitted, over the ocean's
ocean bed.
Yeah. Many other things, and we will be discussing all this at Strategy&Future. We are right now entering the era of major showdown in Eurasia, contest for power, and the new order. As I said, whether this will be a restored U.S. power in the globalized world with the freedom of strategic flows, after some time, or a concert of powers with more chaotic, more polarized, and more volatile environment for business, for us, for people, for politicians, for nations. We will see. Poland as a middle power will be watching it, and we will be watching it from Poland.
Do remember, we'll provide it to you from the place where it all happens, from one of those crucial choke points in the global
corridors,
trades. Yes.
Crossroads of strategic flows.
So stay tuned. There is more where that came from, and take care.
Thanks.
Thank you.